Narayana Samarambam Vyasa Shankara Madhyamam Asmadacharya Paryantam Vande Guru Paramparam. Om Vasudevendra Yogindram Natva Jnana Pradam Gurum Mumukshunam Hitartaya Tattva Bodha Vidiyate. In this video, we'll continue the discussion that was started in the last video about discrimination. We're distilling the logic of discrimination from the scriptures and putting them into a more concentrated or manageable format here. So everything that we've talked about previously and everything we'll talk about now is actually taken from the scriptures themselves. This isn't some kind of method or logic that I have personally created. You might wonder, we've been talking about Tattva Bodha for many videos. Maybe this is the 13th, 14th video about Tattva Bodha. You might say, well, why have we not covered more of the text? We've barely done the first couple of verses. Why are we taking so much time on this topic of discrimination, for instance? And like I said before, if you ever have a question about what Vedanta is, the answer is that it is discrimination, and discrimination alone. The whole purpose of the teaching is this discrimination, making the distinction between what you are and what you are not, between self and not self, between Atma and Anatma. Because samsara, or suffering, is the belief that objects are real and that we are the objects. In other words, the belief that objects are real and the subsequent identification with objects. So the only way to see that objects are not real and that we are not objects is to use this discrimination. It's not like when we take up different texts later on. Maybe the next text we'll take up is Drik-Drik Viveka, or maybe Viveka Chudamani. It won't be that when we get to those texts, you're suddenly given a more advanced or a secret teaching or a final teaching that you've earned by learning Tattva Bodha. That isn't exactly the way that we do things in Vedanta. In Vedanta, we are going to give you the big picture right up front. That's what we're doing here, is giving you the benefit of the doubt. We want to just give you the big picture right up front, and then if it doesn't make sense, we will continue to explain the big picture, explain the claims that Vedanta makes. So if we take a lot of time with a particular topic, or we take a lot of time with a particular text, it's not a loss on your part. It's not like we're going to get to a more advanced teaching or get to a different teaching if we just hurry up and get to the next text. All of the texts say the same thing in a different way. They present the material from a different perspective. They use different metaphors. They look at the same problem of suffering or samsara from different angles. And at the bottom line are teaching you to discriminate yourself, to distinguish yourself from objects. So even if we talked about Tattva Bodha for the next 6 years, which we won't, it's not like you'd be missing out on anything, because you are learning Vedanta all the way through and through with this discussion. So let's pick things up here with our discussion of discrimination. We've started talking about the logic behind the discrimination, and we covered 2 points in the last video, and I didn't have time to cover the third one, so that's what we'll talk about today. But to recap the first 2 points, the first point is that you are the conscious subject and you cannot be the unconscious objects that are known to you. Or to put it more simply, you cannot be what you know. Anything that you can say, this is, that is, I smelled this, I saw this, I touched that, I experienced that, I thought this, I felt this, any of those things are known to you, including the mind itself, which is the knower of those things. There's perception, and the mind is the knower of that perception. So even the mind itself is something that is known to you. If you are the knower, you cannot be the known. The knower, the self, is consciousness. And consciousness is conscious, not to be redundant. But I want to make clear that consciousness is not something that you possess. It's not a power that you hold. It is what you are. So you are the consciousness that makes it possible to know objects. If you are the knower, you cannot be the known. If you are conscious, you cannot be the unconscious objects. The objects require consciousness to be known, so they themselves are unconscious. They do not reveal themselves. They need you, consciousness, to reveal them. That is point number 1. You cannot be what you know. Point number 2 is that you are real. And objects, or if you want to just classify objects as experience in general, are unreal. Objects or experience in general is unreal, while you, consciousness, the self, are real. Something can only be said to be real if it is always present and never changing. So that means that it has to be something that was never created, that was never born, so to speak, something that never changes, and that's something that never dies or disappears or becomes non-existent. So real means eternal, having no beginning and no end. So always being present. Eternal and also unchanging. If you look at experience, if you look at objects, you will see that objects only exist for a finite period of time. There's a time when an object doesn't exist, there's a time that it exists, and there's a time when it goes back to non-existence. Even when an object temporarily exists, it undergoes change. So for all of those reasons, it can't be real. How real can something be if it's non-existent at one time, existent at one time, and non-existent again later? How real can something be when it's one thing one moment and one thing the next? Experience in general is like that. Your experience changes from moment to moment, from second to second. So it itself cannot be real. However, you, in all of those experiences of different objects, are present, because consciousness is always present in any experience. There's not an object or an experience of an object without you, consciousness. And even though the experience changes from moment to moment, you are there, present and unchanged. You don't come into existence at the beginning of an experience. You don't change during the experience, and you don't become non-existent when the experience ends. You were already present before this video started. You are present during this video, and when the experience of this video ends, you will still be existent, even though the experience of the video has come and gone. So that means that objects or experience is unreal, and that you, consciousness, the self, or Atma, are real. And of course it is illogical for you to be both real and unreal at the same time. So you cannot be experience. You cannot be objects, because you are real and they are unreal. So that is the first 2 points that outline the basics of discrimination and the logic that goes behind it. Because we don't want you just to say, I don't want you just to regurgitate or repeat this list. You need to understand why this is true. You need to understand why you cannot be what you know. You need to understand why objects are unreal and why you are real. And by understanding those things, then you can clearly make the distinction. You can clearly distinguish between what you are and what you are not. Because you can say, well, that's something I know. Well, if it's something I know, then it can't be me. And if I understand why it can't be me, then it's not just a belief. It becomes knowledge. It becomes understanding. And that's what we want here. So we want you to know the reasons so you can understand them, apply them, and assimilate them. Those are the first 2. And now we will take up the third. And this is the fact that you, consciousness, the self, exist independently. Meaning you don't depend on any other thing, on any object, to be what you are. You don't require anything else to exist. You don't require anything else to be consciousness. All of the objects, on the other hand, depend on something else to exist. They do not exist on their own. They have to borrow existence from you. And this is a subtle topic, but it's a very important one. So try to explain this as clearly as possible and take some time with it if necessary. So what we're saying then is, you as consciousness exist independently. You are what you are, and that doesn't depend on any particular object. You don't need any objects, you don't need anything else aside from yourself to exist, because you are consciousness, and existence and consciousness are actually the same thing. So we can use a metaphor of a table, for instance, to try to illustrate this idea here. Now, when we say table, table itself is just a word. It's a sound. And we can ask ourselves, does the name table exist independently? Okay, can there be the name table on its own? Or does there have to be something else for the name table, the word table, to exist? Now, we don't have names for things that don't exist. We don't just say table unless it refers to something else. Now, you might say, well, we have a word for a unicorn, for instance, but unicorns don't actually exist. Well, that is true. There may not actually be a real unicorn, but the name unicorn refers to an idea. when I say unicorn, it's not that you have no idea what I'm talking about. Probably a horse with a horn in the middle of its head pops into your mind because you have experienced the idea of a unicorn, whether it be as a picture or in a cartoon or in a movie or maybe in your imagination as you read a book. So even words that refer to what we might consider to be imaginary still refer to something, even if it's just a depiction of that thing or an idea of that thing. So keeping that in mind, we don't have words or names without something to refer to. So when we say table, does table exist on its own, or does it depend on something to exist? Well, following the logic that we just explained, then we have to conclude that table is only a name that depends on a particular form or shape to be. Say, when we see something that's flat, that has 4 legs coming off of the bottom of it, we say table. So in that case, we can see that the name table has to depend on that form. So the name is independently existent. Or, I'm sorry, the name is dependently existent. The name can only exist because of the form that it refers to. However, we can take it another step forward, right? We can take it at the level of name and we can apply that to experience in general. We say that there are names for everything in our experience. We refer to something, a table, a house, a chair, a person, a situation, a feeling. Those names themselves are not dependently existent because there has to be forms for those names to refer to. So we can write those off and say, all right, those are dependently existent. They can't be the self. They can't be consciousness. So if we have a form that we are referring to as table, does the form exist independently on its own without the support of anything else? Or does it exist independently without the support or help of anything else? You know, when you see a table, is it actually a substance called table that exists on its own, or is it something else? If you take a closer look, you'll see that the form or the shape that we refer to as a table does not exist independently on its own, because there can't be a form or a shape that we call table without wood. In this instance, we can say that wood exists independently of the shape or form that we call table. When we have this form, in fact, there is only the wood itself. So we could continue to break down the wood. We could say, well, the wood depends on wood fibers. The wood fibers depend on cellulose. Cellulose depends on cells. Cells depend on atoms. Atoms depend on protons, neutrons, and electrons. And we could keep breaking things down farther and farther and farther and farther. But we don't really need to do that for this example, because whether we're talking about wood or what wood is made of, or what the fibers that make up wood are made of, or what atoms are made of, the same logic applies here. Whether we're talking about a form that we call a table, or we're talking about what makes up the table, all of those things are objects that are known. So we have to ask ourselves then, are objects independently existent? or do they depend on something else? We'll go back to the wood here. We'll just stay at the level of the example where we're looking at wood. We've determined that name is not independently existent. We've determined that form is not independently existent. And if you look at your experience, experience is nothing but name and form. If you say, I experience this chair, chair is a name that refers to a form. So if we've negated name as being independently existent, and we've negated form as being independently existent, we have to ask, well, what then does it depend on for its existence? So we can use the wood here as our example and say, well, how can you say that wood exists? Does wood exist on its own by itself? Does it reveal itself? Does it stand there alone? Well, it really doesn't, because how can you say that any form exists without the presence of consciousness? Now, objects are just experience, and you can see that it's not possible to have experience without consciousness. So in that regard, we can see then that ultimately all of the experience, all of the objects are dependent on you, consciousness, to exist. Now, the question might come up, well, does consciousness depend on something else to exist? The short answer to that question is no, because consciousness is existence itself. If we have existence, consciousness is present, existence actually is consciousness. They are the same thing, but we can look at it from a different angle. If we say that objects depend on consciousness to exist, because you can't say an object exists without consciousness, how could you have another consciousness that knows consciousness? If you have two consciousnesses, right, and they're both consciousness, are they actually different? A plurality of something does not make a difference in something. If you have two drops of water, then both of them are equally and the same water. So even if you had two consciousnesses, you'd still only have one consciousness, because consciousness is homogeneous. Right? It's always the same. There's no difference or change in consciousness. So just having two consciousnesses would not make it actually two, because they would be two of the exact same thing. Another way to look at it is to say, all right, well, if there's something that knows consciousness, then that consciousness becomes the knower, and the consciousness it knows becomes an object. If consciousness becomes an object that's known, then it becomes unconscious, because following our logic before, there is a knower and there is the known. The known does not reveal itself, and so the knower is conscious, and the consciousness and the object that's known is unconscious. You can't have a knower of consciousness, because consciousness is knowingness itself. And besides, you can get into a regression of ideas that in philosophy is called regressus ad infinitum. I may be mispronouncing that, but the idea is that you just continuously regress backwards in your ideas, which does not give you any kind of logical conclusion, right? Because if you say that consciousness is an object known by a different consciousness, then you can say, well, what if there's a consciousness that knows the consciousness that knows the consciousness? All right, so we've got three consciousnesses, and then you could say, well, what's the consciousness that knows the consciousness that knows the consciousness that knows consciousness? and you could go back ad infinitum. So there's no logic there. It doesn't make any sense. The buck stops with consciousness as the knower because consciousness is knowingness itself. So that means that there are objects and that are dependently existent. They can only exist. They borrow their existence from you, consciousness, or existence itself. So you cannot be both the independent consciousness and the dependent objects. They are in different orders of reality, so to speak. Now, someone might say, well, you're saying that consciousness has to be present to say an object exists. So the existence of an object depends on consciousness. Well, what if there is some microscopic organism living underneath a rock somewhere that no one's ever seen? Does it exist? The answer is that it very well might. And the reason is because existence doesn't depend on perception. Existence doesn't depend on your mind. This is a really important point. And how can this be true? How is it that the existence of something doesn't depend on your perception of it? The short answer is that consciousness doesn't depend on perception. And why is that? Because perception itself is an object. Now, for instance, let's say we go into a cave somewhere, we flip over a rock, and there's a tiny little organism there that's never been discovered before. Now, how do you know that that organism is there? You know because the thought of that organism appears in your mind. It's just a thought that appears in your mind. The perception of that organism itself is a thought that appears in your mind. Now, we've already established clearly that anything that's known to you is an object, correct? So, what we're saying here is that the perception of anything, or perception itself, is actually a known object. And we're saying that all objects depend on you, consciousness. So we can't say that the existence of a particular object depends on another object. Okay, I can't say that the existence of a little microscopic organism, which is an object, depends on another object, which is perception. Both of them are objects. And both of those objects depend on consciousness, you, to exist. So the point is that anything anywhere that's an object has to depend on its existence, depends on its existence on you, consciousness itself. So perception does not make something exist. Something may or may not exist whenever you see it. Okay? I can tell you for sure that I exist when you don't see these videos, but that's not really the point. We're just trying to make the point that consciousness is not perception. Perception is an object that is known to consciousness. And the final point that this brings up, and it's also an important one, if I haven't said this before, consciousness does not depend on your mind. Consciousness does not depend on your brain. Your mind and your brain are unconscious objects. Your mind is known to you, and so it is an object, and therefore cannot be conscious. The knower is consciousness. The known object is unconscious. And why is this an important point to make? Well, because the commonly accepted wisdom is that consciousness is either a function of the brain, or consciousness is viewed as the stream of thoughts in your mind. As long as your mind is thinking thoughts, then that's consciousness, or the brain itself is generating consciousness. Now, the stream of thoughts cannot be consciousness, because the stream of thoughts are objects that are revealed by consciousness. And if they are revealed by consciousness, then they cannot be consciousness. They have to be unconscious objects. Now, maybe someone will say, well, the brain is creating consciousness. Let's say right off the bat here that consciousness is not a part, is not a product, is not a property, and is not a function of the body, the mind, or any combination of the two. I'll repeat that. Consciousness is not a part, is not a product, is not a function of or a property of the body or the mind or any combination of the two. Consciousness is not a property that belongs to the body or the mind. It's not a part of the body and the mind. It's not a function of the body and the mind. We've explained why consciousness can't be the mind if the mind is considered to be the flow of thoughts, because thoughts are known objects. The reason that consciousness cannot come from the brain is rather simple. What is the brain? The brain is just matter. If you want to put it more simply, the brain is just a piece of meat. What's a brain is not entirely different from a hamburger or a steak. It's just a piece of meat. It's a collection of matter in a particular form. The difference, I suppose you could say, is that from a biological standpoint, ground beef is not alive and the brain is alive. Now, why is the brain alive? Because it has electrical impulses moving through it. So the brain then is a combination of matter or cells and electricity, electrical impulses. Now, is matter conscious? Let's leave out the whole logic of Vedanta where we say that the knower is conscious and the known is unconscious. Let's just leave that out for a moment. Is matter conscious? Are atoms conscious? Now see, that's exactly what the brain is made out of. Ultimately, we could break it down and say, well, the brain is made out of matter, which is just atoms. Atoms are protons, neutrons, and electrons. Are any of those conscious? Do they have consciousness? No, they don't. It's obvious that they don't have consciousness. If I take that matter and I put electricity through it, does it suddenly become conscious? You know, if matter has no consciousness to give, how can it suddenly become conscious? Now, is it because if we add electrical impulses to it, it creates consciousness? Well, is electricity conscious? It isn't. Ultimately, electricity is just matter. It's a particular flow of electrons in a particular direction, as far as I understand it. So it's just energy or matter, however you want to look at it. And matter in the form of electricity is not conscious. So you have matter in the form of a brain, in the form of meat that makes up a brain, and you have matter in the form of electricity that courses through that brain, creating certain functions. That is true. In that regard, the brain is like a computer. There's a computer sitting in front of me right now that's just made out of matter. It has electricity moving through it, and this computer thinks, if you will, meaning it performs all kinds of functions. It can do math, it can run programs, it can do all kinds of amazing things, and that is true. Similar to the brain. The brain can think, it can do different things. It is an amazing instrument. But just like this computer, it is not conscious. It's just a lump of matter. Unconscious matter in the form of the body of the computer, and unconscious electricity moving through all of its circuits and chips. That's it. No one would argue that a computer is conscious. The brain is the same thing. It's just unconscious matter with unconscious electricity moving through it. So if we have something that's unconscious and something else that's unconscious, if we put them together and shake them up, does it create consciousness? No, because there's no consciousness to give in the first place. The brain is just an unconscious instrument in which functions happen. And those functions, as they appear as thoughts or as they appear as regulating functions in the body, are objects that are known in consciousness. So I just want to make that very clear, that when I'm using this word consciousness, I am not referring to a part of the body. I'm not referring to a property of the body. I'm not referring to a function of the body. I'm not referring to anything that is created by the body or the brain or any combination of the two. I'm referring to non-dual consciousness, the indivisible, unchanging, independently existent, eternal, infinite inner essence of everything. That's what we are talking about. That's what the mind appears in. The mind appears in you. The brain and its functions appear in you. They are objects. They are known to you. They are dependently existent, and they are unconscious. And that basically, right there, summarizes what we've been discussing here about discrimination. You are the knower. You are the subject. The objects are known. They are unconscious. You are always present and unchanged. That means you are real. The objects are not always present, and they are constantly changing, so they are unreal. You are always real, so you cannot be the unreal objects. You, consciousness, exist independently. You don't depend on anything else to be conscious. You don't depend on anything to exist. You don't depend on anything to be what you are. However, the objects only exist when they borrow existence from consciousness, because you cannot ever say that any object exists without the presence of you, consciousness. And that consciousness is not perception of an object. The existence of objects do not depend on perception, because perception itself is an object that is known to you. So you are the knower, you are real, and you exist independently. That is the criteria for discrimination. Those are the things that you have to know. That's what you are. The objects are known, they are unconscious, they are unreal, and they only exist dependently. Anything that exists dependently or depends on something else for existence is not real, cannot be you. And that's what we have to keep in mind continuously as we contemplate these teachings of Vedanta, because this logic is the tool, this methodology is the tool for making the distinction between what you are and what you are not, between the self and the not self. And that is the key to permanent freedom. So we may continue this discussion about discrimination a little bit in the next video, or we may move on in the text. I'm not exactly sure. Whether we continue this discussion or move on in the text, it doesn't really matter, because we're giving you all that Vedanta has right now. We're giving you the whole teaching, the whole enchilada. We're giving you the big picture that will allow you, when used properly and understood completely, to set yourself free. So we'll come back and discuss this a little bit more in the next video. Purnamidaf, Purnamidam, Purnat, Purnamadachyate, Purnasya, Purnamadaya, Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.
Bhaja Govindam, Bhaja Govindam.